Power is easy when everything is for sale. Ethan Caldwell had built his life on that belief, sculpting his body the same way he sculpted his empire, deliberate, disciplined, controlled. The private gym on the 42nd floor of Caldwell Tower overlooked the Chicago skyline, the early morning sun spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows and glinting off steel and glass. At 6'3" and 210 pounds of controlled strength, Ethan moved through his final set with mechanical precision, the quiet hum of the city below barely registering in his focus. Sweat traced the line of his jaw as he caught his reflection in the mirror, broad shoulders, steady eyes, a man accustomed to commanding outcomes. He did not believe in chance. He believed in contracts, strategy, and timing. At 38, he had acquired companies, reshaped markets, and doubled revenue in less than 5 years. The board called him decisive. The press called him relentless. He preferred efficient. Later that morning, seated at the head of a 12-foot walnut conference table, he reviewed the final draft of the surrogacy agreement without emotion. His attorney outlined clauses in a calm, clinical voice: medical screenings, confidentiality, compensation structured in quarterly disbursements. "You understand this is purely gestational," the attorney added. "No genetic connection." Ethan nodded once. "I understand." He had no interest in romance, no interest in complications. He wanted a child, an heir, stability for the Caldwell legacy. Love was unpredictable. Contracts were not. The surrogate had passed background checks, psychological evaluations, and a comprehensive medical review. Her name was Amara Brooks. 26. Graduate degree in social work. No criminal record. No scandals. Her file described her as calm, resilient, reliable. Ethan signed the preliminary authorization with a smooth stroke of his Mont-Blanc pen. Outside the conference room, executives moved briskly through hallways, heels clicking against marble floors, assistants whispering into Bluetooth headsets. The world functioned on agreements. This would be no different. By noon, Ethan arrived at the fertility clinic on the North Shore, a discreet facility known for privacy and precision. Frosted glass doors muted the view of the lobby. The scent of antiseptic and fresh linen lingered in the air. He removed his suit jacket, draping it neatly over the arm of a leather chair while the reproductive specialist reviewed the final intake forms. "Everything is in order," the doctor said, flipping pages. "We're ready to schedule the embryo transfer." Ethan's gaze remained steady, analytical. This was a transaction with purpose. He did not expect surprises. The doctor paused for a fraction of a second, eyes lowering to a notation near the bottom of the page. It was subtle, almost an afterthought. "Patient has never been sexually active." The words were clinical, typed in plain black ink, but they altered the temperature of the room. Ethan's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the edge of the folder. He did not react outwardly. He rarely did. "Clarify," he said quietly. The doctor adjusted his glasses. "It simply means Ms. Brooks has no prior sexual history. It's medically relevant for procedural considerations, but it does not affect her suitability." Ethan leaned back slightly, the leather chair whispering against the polished floor. Across the room, Amara Brooks sat upright in a pale blue armchair, hands folded in her lap. Her posture was composed, shoulders squared, chin level. She was dressed simply: cream blouse, navy slacks, natural curls pulled back neatly. Her dark eyes did not waver when he looked at her. There was no embarrassment in her expression, no apology, only steadiness. For a moment, the clinic's muted hum faded into the background. Ethan had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with less hesitation than he felt in that instant. Virgin. The word did not scandalize him. It unsettled him for a different reason. Contracts required clarity. This detail introduced something intangible. "Excuse us," Ethan said, his tone even. The doctor hesitated, then nodded, guiding the nurse and technician out of the room. The door closed softly, sealing the space in quiet. Sunlight filtered through partially drawn blinds, casting thin bands of light across the carpet. Ethan stood, buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm. "You're aware of what this process entails," he said, not unkindly. Amara met his gaze. "Yes." Her voice was low, controlled. "I've reviewed every step." "And you're comfortable proceeding?" She inhaled slowly, then released the breath. "I wouldn't have applied if I wasn't." There was no tremor in her tone, no desperation, only conviction. Ethan studied her more closely now, not as a line item in a portfolio, but as a person sitting 10 feet away from him. Why, he asked. It was not an interrogation. It was a genuine question. Amara's fingers intertwined briefly, then relaxed. My mother was diagnosed with stage 3 lymphoma last year. Insurance covers part of it. Not enough. She did not lower her eyes. I won't pretend this is easy, but I make my own choices. The room held that statement in silence. Ethan had expected vulnerability. Instead, he saw resolve. He had built an empire on recognizing leverage points, weaknesses, opportunities. Amara Brooks did not present herself as leverage. She presented herself as deliberate. You understand, he said carefully, that you don't owe anyone the cost of your boundaries. A faint crease appeared between her brows. With respect, Mr. Caldwell, you don't get to define my boundaries. The words were calm, not confrontational. They landed with clarity. Ethan exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, a negotiation felt misplaced. This was not about quarterly returns or shareholder expectations. This was about something he had never needed to weigh, dignity that did not fluctuate with a wire transfer. He stepped toward the table, picking up the contract folder. I won't proceed, he said. Amara's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Not relief. Not anger. Assessment. Because of the note? She asked. Because I don't want a decision like this tied to financial pressure, he replied. Not for you. She rose from her chair, smoothing the front of her blouse. Then I assume that's the end of it. There was no plea in her voice. No appeal. She gathered her purse from the side table. Ethan watched her for a moment longer, the weight of his own certainty pressing against something unfamiliar inside him. Your mother's treatment, he said, his voice steady. It will be covered. She stilled, turning back toward him. That's not part of the agreement. It doesn't need to be. She studied him as if measuring intent. I don't accept charity. It's not charity, he answered. It's respect. The word lingered between them, heavier than any contractual clause. Outside the closed door, the clinic staff continued their routines, unaware that a decision had just shifted course. Ethan Caldwell, who had spent his life acquiring control, found himself relinquishing it in a way that felt more deliberate than any takeover he had executed. Amara Brooks stood tall, neither grateful nor offended, simply processing. For the first time that day, Ethan felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Not doubt, not weakness, but recognition that power did not always mean proceeding. Sometimes it meant stopping. And in the quiet light of that clinic room, beneath the soft hum of fluorescent fixtures and the distant rhythm of the city beyond the glass, a billionaire accustomed to buying outcomes chose something else entirely. He chose to protect a boundary that was not his to cross. Amara did not leave the clinic immediately. She stepped into the hallway, the soft beige carpet muting the sound of her heels, and paused beside a tall window that overlooked the parking lot below. The sky was pale, almost colorless, the kind of Midwestern afternoon that felt suspended between seasons. She pressed her fingers lightly against the strap of her purse, steadying her breath. She had walked into that building prepared to trade time, discomfort, and privacy for money that could keep her mother alive. She had not walked in expecting a man like Ethan Caldwell to refuse the arrangement on principle. Inside the consultation room, Ethan remained still for a long moment after she exited. The folder rested on the table and signed beyond the preliminary authorization. He had spent his life finalizing deals in less time than it took to review a weather report. Yet this decision felt heavier than any acquisition. He picked up his phone and called his chief of staff. Cancel the transfer schedule, he said calmly. All related payments will be honored in full. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sir, you heard me. His tone was steady, leaving no room for negotiation. He ended the call before questions could follow. Across town, Caldwell Tower reflected the afternoon sun like a polished mirror. By the time Ethan returned to his office, his executive team was already circulating rumors. Decisions did not shift without reason. He walked through the lobby with the same composed stride, acknowledging no one beyond a brief nod to the receptionist. Inside his corner office, floor-to-ceiling glass framed Lake Michigan in the distance. He loosened his tie slightly, not from stress, but from contemplation. He replayed the moment Amara had said, "You do not get to define my boundaries." No one had spoken to him that way in years, not without calculation or fear. It had not been defiance. It had been clarity. Meanwhile, Amara stepped out into the clinic parking lot and inhaled the crisp air. She checked her phone. 3 missed calls from the hospital. Her chest tightened. She dialed back immediately, pacing between rows of cars. The nurse's voice on the other end was gentle but direct. The next round of chemotherapy needed to be scheduled within 10 days. Insurance approvals were pending. Estimated out-of-pocket costs were outlined in clinical numbers that sounded unreal when spoken aloud. Amara closed her eyes briefly, letting the information settle. She thanked the nurse and ended the call. For a moment, the weight of reality pressed against her ribs. She had been prepared to endure scrutiny and judgment for a contractual pregnancy. Now that path was closed. Or so she thought. Her phone vibrated again. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. She hesitated, then answered. "This is Amara. Ms. Brooks. This is Leland Morris from Northwestern Oncology Billing. I am calling to confirm receipt of a private endowment covering your mother's treatment plan in full." She stopped walking. "I am sorry, what?" "The entire projected cost, including medication and inpatient care, has been transferred through a medical trust effective immediately." Her mind raced. "There must be a mistake." "There is no mistake, ma'am. The trust specifies complete anonymity. You are not required to take any action." The call ended as quietly as it had begun. Amara remained standing between 2 sedans, the wind tugging gently at her curls. She did not need confirmation of who had done it. The timing alone told her. Back in his office, Ethan reviewed a draft agreement prepared by his legal team. It was not a surrogacy contract. It was the formation of a charitable medical trust, structured to protect both recipient and donor. He signed the final page without ceremony. This was not a public relations maneuver. No press release would follow. He did not need gratitude. He needed alignment with his own sense of order. Later that evening, as the city lights flickered on one by one, Amara sat beside her mother's hospital bed. The room was dim except for the soft glow of a monitor. Her mother slept, breath slow and rhythmic. Amara held her hand gently, tracing the familiar lines of a woman who had raised her with quiet strength. She had grown up watching her mother work double shifts without complaint, teaching her that dignity was not negotiable. That lesson echoed now more than ever. Her phone buzzed with a text from the clinic confirming cancellation of the procedure. No explanation. No apology. Just closure. She typed a message to Ethan Caldwell, hesitated, then deleted it. Gratitude felt complicated. Pride felt louder. The following morning, Ethan attended a board meeting that lasted 3 hours. Market forecasts, expansion strategies, projected earnings. He listened, contributed, approved initiatives. Yet a portion of his attention remained fixed on a quiet hospital room across the city. During a break, one of the directors approached him. "I heard you withdrew from a personal arrangement," the director said carefully. "Everything all right?" Ethan met his gaze evenly. "Everything is aligned." The director nodded, uncertain but unwilling to press further. Control, Ethan understood, did not always require force. Sometimes it required restraint. That afternoon, as rain streaked lightly against the windows of Caldwell Tower, Amara received a second call from the hospital confirming that her mother's next treatment session had been scheduled. There would be no delay, no partial coverage, no frantic fundraising. She sat at her kitchen table, sunlight diffused by gray clouds, and let the reality sink in. She had entered that clinic prepared to sacrifice comfort for survival. Instead, she had encountered something unfamiliar in a man of power, a refusal to take advantage of her vulnerability. It unsettled her more than the original agreement had. Ethan stood by his office window as evening settled over Chicago. The skyline glowed gold and white against the darkening sky. For years, he had believed that legacy required precision planning. Now he questioned whether legacy might also involve the kind of decision that left no signature visible. He did not expect Amara to call. He did not expect thanks. What he did expect was peace with his own choice. And yet, beneath the steady rhythm of city traffic far below, he felt something shift within him. Not regret, not uncertainty, something quieter. Recognition that the most powerful move he had made in years was the one no one would ever see. 3 days passed without contact, yet the silence between them did not feel empty. It felt deliberate. Chicago moved forward as it always did, trains rattling above ground tracks, taxis threading through late afternoon traffic, the wind off Lake Michigan carrying a sharp edge that hinted at early winter. In Caldwell Tower, the hum of industry continued without interruption. Analysts presented quarterly forecasts, architects displayed renderings for a new waterfront development, and investors dialed in from New York and San Francisco expecting the same decisive leadership they had always known. Ethan Caldwell delivered it flawlessly. His voice remained even, his posture upright, his presence steady at the head of the table. Yet beneath the rhythm of boardroom negotiations, something quieter persisted in his thoughts. He had built his life on measurable returns. What he had done for Amara Brooks had no spreadsheet attached to it. No projected gain. Only a private alignment with something he had nearly forgotten he possessed. Across the city, Amara sat in a vinyl chair beside her mother during another chemotherapy session. The clinic lights were soft but unyielding, casting pale reflections on polished floors. Her mother slept through most of the infusion, her breathing calm, her face thinner than it had been a year ago. Amara watched the slow drip of medication through clear tubing and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to exhale without calculation. The financial weight that had pressed against her ribs every morning had eased. Not disappeared entirely, but eased. Nurses moved quietly in the background, adjusting monitors, offering blankets. One of them paused beside Amara and smiled gently. "It is good to see families supported," she said. Amara nodded, her throat tightening slightly. She did not correct the nurse. She did not explain the complexity of that support. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline and painted the clouds in muted shades of orange and gray, Ethan left his office later than usual. Instead of instructing his driver to take him home to his penthouse overlooking the river, he gave a different address. The car moved south through the city, past rows of brick townhouses and corner stores with flickering neon signs. He watched the neighborhoods shift from polished corporate glass to lived-in sidewalks and modest apartment buildings. When the car stopped outside Northwestern Oncology, he stepped out alone. He had not announced his arrival. He had not scheduled a meeting. He simply walked through the sliding glass doors, nodding to the receptionist who recognized his name but did not question his purpose. He found Amara in the waiting area near the infusion wing. She sat with a paperback book resting in her lap, though she was not reading it. Her posture was straight, shoulders relaxed, eyes focused somewhere beyond the television mounted silently on the wall. When she noticed him approaching, surprise flickered across her face, but it did not disrupt her composure. "Mr. Caldwell," she said evenly. "Ms. Brooks." He inclined his head slightly. "How is your mother?" She studied him for a moment before answering. "Stable. The doctors are optimistic." He nodded once, absorbing the information as if it were a quarterly report. "I am glad." A brief silence settled between them, not awkward but measured. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the space. "You did not have to come here," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "I did not." "Then why did you?" The question was direct, not accusatory. Ethan considered his answer carefully. "Because I made a decision that affected your life," he said. "I thought it was appropriate to see the result of that decision." She watched him closely, searching for motive. "And what do you see?" He glanced toward the corridor, where patients moved slowly with 4 poles and nurses offered steady guidance. "I see that your mother is receiving care without delay," he said. "That is what matters." Amara's gaze softened slightly, though her guard remained intact. "Most men in your position would have sent a letter," she said. "Or nothing at all." "Most men in my position prefer distance," he replied. "Distance is efficient. And this is not." He allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "No, it is not." She closed her book gently and stood. "My mother is awake," she said. "Would you like to meet her?" The offer surprised him more than any business proposal ever had. "If you are comfortable with that," he answered. "I would." Inside the infusion room, her mother looked smaller than her daughter, yet there was strength in the way she held her chin. Amara introduced him simply. "This is Ethan Caldwell. He helped us." Her mother's eyes assessed him with quiet intelligence. "Helped how?" she asked. Ethan did not embellish. "I ensured your treatment would continue without interruption." The older woman studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Then you have my gratitude," she said. "But understand something, Mr. Caldwell. My daughter does not belong to anyone." The statement was calm but unwavering. Ethan met her gaze without defensiveness. "I understand," he said. "She made that very clear." Amara felt a subtle shift in the air, something unspoken yet acknowledged. Her mother reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Good," she murmured. Later, when they stepped back into the hallway, Amara faced him again. "You could have used this," she said quietly. "Publicity, influence, leverage." "Leverage is for negotiations," he replied. This was not a negotiation. Then what is it? He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a file, not as a potential surrogate, but as a woman who had stood her ground in a room designed to intimidate. "It is a choice," he said, "one I intend to stand by." The overhead lights cast a soft glow against the hospital walls, reflecting in her dark eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city outside continued its restless rhythm, unaware that something subtle and significant had shifted within those sterile corridors. Ethan Caldwell had entered the building as a man accustomed to control. He left it understanding that some decisions were not about acquisition or legacy, but about respect. And Amara Brooks, who had prepared herself to endure judgment for survival, found herself facing a different kind of challenge entirely. Not how to protect her dignity from exploitation, but how to interpret a power that had chosen restraint instead of advantage. The hospital corridor lingered in Ethan's thoughts long after he returned to Caldwell Tower. The scent of antiseptic had been replaced by polished wood and expensive cologne, yet the quiet strength in Amara's mother's voice echoed with surprising clarity. "My daughter does not belong to anyone." The statement had not been confrontational. It had been protective. It was a tone Ethan recognized from boardrooms, from founders guarding their companies against hostile takeovers. Except this was not about assets. It was about autonomy. The following week unfolded with the precision of any other in his calendar. Breakfast meetings began at 7 sharp. Conference calls bridged time zones from Chicago to London. Analysts debated expansion into renewable infrastructure. Ethan navigated each discussion with practiced calm, but he found himself noticing something new in his own language. He listened more carefully. He paused before concluding. Control, he realized, did not weaken when shared thoughtfully. It deepened. Across the city, Amara balanced hospital visits with her part-time position at a community outreach center on the south side. The center operated out of a converted brick building with wide windows and a mural painted along the exterior wall, celebrating resilience and unity. She coordinated after-school programs for teenagers, helping them prepare college applications and financial aid forms. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above folding tables scattered with notebooks and laptops. When the students asked about her week, she smiled and deflected. She did not mention hospital corridors or unexpected benefactors. She preferred her life uncomplicated by speculation. Yet beneath her steady demeanor, a quiet tension lingered. Ethan's presence at the hospital had unsettled her more than his money had. Money could be rationalized. A visit required intention. One afternoon, as a light snow began to dust the sidewalks, Ethan received an email from his public relations director flagged urgent. A blogger had posted speculation about a private medical trust connected to Caldwell Enterprises. The article contained no names, only insinuations about discreet generosity toward an unidentified recipient. Ethan read it once, then closed the file. He summoned his legal counsel. "Trace the source," he instructed calmly. "Shut down any further exposure. No statements." "Understood," the counsel replied. "Do you want to confirm or deny?" Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the skyline beyond the glass. "Neither. This is not a story." He ended the meeting and leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. He had intended the trust to remain invisible. Visibility complicated intention. That evening, Amara left the outreach center later than usual. Snowflakes clung to her coat as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Her phone vibrated in her hand with a message from an unfamiliar number containing a link. Curiosity edged with caution. She opened it and saw the headline speculating about anonymous philanthropy tied to a prominent Chicago executive. Though her name was not mentioned, her pulse quickened. She recognized the timing. She recognized the magnitude. The weight of anonymity felt suddenly fragile. Moments later, another message appeared, this one from Ethan. It was brief and direct. "I am handling it. Your privacy will remain intact." She stared at the words for several seconds before replying. "I did not ask you to." His response came almost immediately. "I know." The simplicity of it unsettled her more than any elaborate reassurance could have. She reached her apartment building and paused under the awning, watching traffic crawl slowly through the snow. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air. For months, survival had required compromise calculations. Now she was navigating something more complicated: trust. The next day, Ethan arrived unannounced at the outreach center just before closing time. He wore a dark overcoat that contrasted sharply with the bright mural on the building's exterior. Inside, folding chairs scraped lightly against the floor as students packed up backpacks. Conversations softened when they noticed him. He was not a man who blended easily into modest spaces. Amara stepped forward, surprise flickering across her face. "You could have called," she said quietly. "I could have," he replied. "May we speak?" She glanced toward her coworkers, then nodded and guided him toward a small office partitioned by glass panels. The room contained a simple desk, two mismatched chairs, and a corkboard pinned with scholarship deadlines. "The article will disappear," he said evenly. "My team is ensuring it does not resurface." She folded her arms lightly, not defensive but measured. "You move quickly. Speed prevents escalation. And what if escalation is inevitable?" He studied her expression. "Then I will absorb it." She searched his face for calculation. "Why?" she asked again, the same question she had posed in the hospital hallway. "Because I made a choice," he answered. "And I do not retreat from my choices when they become inconvenient." The office lights cast a soft glow across the small space. Outside the glass, laughter echoed faintly as students said their goodbyes. Amara considered the distance between this room and his tower of steel and glass. "You are not used to people questioning you," she said. "No," he admitted. "I am not." "Then understand this. I am not a project. I am not a redemption arc. I am a woman protecting her family." The words were steady, firm, unembellished. Ethan inclined his head slightly. "I do understand." A quiet settled between them, filled only by the distant hum of the heating system. For the first time, Amara sensed something shift not just in him, but in herself. The tension that had defined their interactions eased by a fraction. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Outside, the snowfall intensified, coating the mural in white. The world moved on, indifferent to private transformations unfolding within modest rooms and towering offices alike. Ethan stepped back toward the door. "If your mother requires anything further, inform me," he said. "Through proper channels," she replied. A faint hint of warmth touched his expression. "Of course." He exited into the cold evening air, snow settling briefly on his shoulders before melting. Amara watched through the window as he walked toward his car, posture straight, steps deliberate. He looked exactly as he always had: powerful, composed, self-assured. Yet she knew something the headlines never would. Power, when restrained by respect, carried a different weight entirely. And in that difference lay the fragile beginning of something neither of them had anticipated. The snow that had coated Chicago earlier in the week began to melt under a sudden stretch of clear skies, leaving the city washed and reflective, as if winter itself had paused to reconsider its hold. At Northwestern Oncology, the rhythm of treatment continued with quiet persistence. Amara sat beside her mother during another infusion session, her laptop open on her knees as she answered emails from the outreach center. The soft beeping of monitors blended with the distant murmur of nurses exchanging updates. Her mother's complexion carried more color than it had a month ago, subtle but visible. Progress measured in small mercies. "You look tired," her mother said gently, her voice thin but steady. Amara smiled faintly. "I am fine. Do not lie to me," her mother replied, a spark of familiar authority flickering in her eyes. "You are carrying more than you admit." Amara hesitated, then closed the laptop. "Things are changing," she said carefully, "in ways I did not expect." Her mother studied her face with quiet intuition. "The man." Amara exhaled softly. "Yes, the man." Meanwhile, in a glass conference room overlooking Lake Michigan, Ethan reviewed a proposal that would expand Caldwell Enterprises into medical technology manufacturing. The irony did not escape him. He listened to the presentation with composed focus, but when the discussion turned toward projected margins, his thoughts drifted to the infusion room, where numbers meant survival rather than profit. When the meeting adjourned, he remained seated while the others filed out. He glanced at his reflection in the darkened window. For years, he had defined success by acquisition and expansion. Lately, he found himself measuring something else entirely: integrity under scrutiny. Later that afternoon, Amara received a call from the hospital's social services coordinator requesting updated documentation for her mother's care plan. The medical trust covered expenses, but formalities remained. She stepped into the hallway to take the call, the scent of antiseptic sharp in the air. As she ended the conversation, she nearly collided with Ethan, who had approached quietly. He wore a charcoal suit, coat folded over one arm, presence unmistakable even in a sterile corridor. "You have a habit of appearing unannounced," she said softly. "I am beginning to notice," he replied evenly. She searched his expression. "Is something wrong?" "No," he said. "I was nearby for a meeting. I wanted to check on your mother." She studied him for a moment, weighing sincerity against habit. "She is improving," she said finally. "Slowly. Slow progress is still progress," he answered. They walked together toward the waiting area, footsteps muted against polished floors. The familiarity of their silence felt different now, less guarded, more observant. "The article is gone," she said after a moment. "Yes. And if it resurfaces?" "Then it resurfaces," he replied. "I will not allow it to define you." She stopped walking. "It does not define me," she said firmly. He met her gaze. "No," he agreed. "It does not." Inside the infusion room, her mother greeted him with a nod that carried more warmth than before. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "You are persistent." "I prefer consistent," he replied. A faint smile touched her lips. "Consistency is rare." Amara watched the exchange carefully. There was no performance in his posture, no exaggerated courtesy, only steadiness. As evening approached, Ethan and Amara stepped outside the hospital together. The air was crisp, but no longer biting. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long reflections on damp pavement. "You could step back now," she said quietly. No one would question it. He looked toward the skyline, where Caldwell Tower rose in clean lines against the fading light. "Would you?" he asked. The question lingered between them. She considered it honestly. "I do not know," she admitted. "Then I will not step back," he said simply. She folded her arms lightly, not in defense, but contemplation. "You are not used to uncertainty." "No," he said. "But I am learning." She studied him in the glow of the streetlight, noticing details she had overlooked before, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his shoulders eased slightly when he was not in a boardroom. "Learning what?" she asked. "That power without purpose is hollow," he replied. "And that purpose is not always profitable." She absorbed his words carefully. "You wanted a child?" she said. "Yes." "Do you still?" He did not hesitate. "Yes." "Then what changes now?" His gaze returned to hers, steady and unguarded. "Everything," he said. The word was not dramatic. It was measured, deliberate. A car passed slowly on the street, headlights sweeping across their faces before fading into the distance. Amara felt a subtle shift within herself, an awareness that the dynamic between them had moved beyond transaction and into something more complex. Not romance, not dependency, something rooted in mutual recognition. "I will not be indebted to you," she said quietly. "You are not," he replied. "You never were." The certainty in his tone carried no arrogance, only clarity. For the first time since walking into the clinic weeks ago, she allowed a fraction of her guard to lower. Not completely, just enough to acknowledge that his actions aligned with his words. In the distance, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet evolution unfolding on a hospital sidewalk. Ethan Caldwell had built an empire on precision and control. Amara Brooks had built her life on resilience and principle. Now they stood at an intersection neither had anticipated, where legacy and dignity intersected not through contract, but through choice. And as the last traces of daylight disappeared behind the skyline, both understood that the decisions ahead would require more than power or pride. They would require trust. Trust is not built in grand gestures. It is built in the quiet consistency of showing up. A week after their conversation beneath the hospital streetlight, Chicago shifted again, the early traces of winter giving way to a brittle, sunlit cold that sharpened the edges of everything it touched. Ethan stood alone in the private gym at Caldwell Tower before sunrise, the city still dim beyond the glass. The rhythmic sound of his breath filled the room as he moved through controlled repetitions, but his thoughts were not on muscle or discipline. They were on a question that had lingered since that night. What changes now? He had answered everything. Now he had to decide what that meant in practice. Across town, Amara sat at her small kitchen table, sunlight spilling across a stack of medical paperwork. Her mother had been discharged for the week, strong enough to recover at home between treatments. The apartment smelled faintly of ginger tea and laundry detergent. For the first time in months, the air felt less fragile. Her mother watched her from the couch, wrapped in a knitted blanket. "You are thinking too loudly," she said gently. Amara looked up, surprised. "I am not thinking. Out loud. You do not have to. I raised you." A faint smile touched Amara's lips. "He is complicated," she admitted. Her mother studied her carefully. "Is he kind?" Amara paused. "Yes." "Is he respectful?" "Yes." "Then the rest can be learned." The simplicity of that statement settled into the room like soft light. Later that afternoon, Ethan made a decision that would have startled his board if they had known. He instructed his assistant to clear his evening schedule. No investor dinners. No networking events. Instead, he drove himself to the Southside Community Center where Amara worked. The building looked smaller in daylight, painted brick warm under the sun. Inside, laughter echoed down the hallway as teenagers gathered for tutoring sessions. Ethan stood near the entrance for a moment, observing. There was no glass tower here, no polished marble floors. Only folding chairs, whiteboards filled with equations, and a mural that read strength and community. Amara noticed him from across the room. She finished speaking with a student before approaching, her expression curious but not startled. "You are becoming predictable," she said softly. "Consistency," he replied. "You said it was rare." She studied him. "Why are you here?" "Because you asked what changes now," he said. And I realized I had not answered fully. She crossed her arms lightly. "And the answer is?" He glanced around the center. "Legacy is not only about bloodlines," he said. "It is about impact." She remained silent, waiting. "I want to fund this place," he continued. "Not in my name. Not as a press release. As infrastructure. Technology. Scholarships. Whatever you determine is necessary." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You think this is about charity?" "No," he said evenly. "I think it is about alignment." She walked toward the office, motioning for him to follow. Inside the small room, the corkboard still displayed scholarship deadlines and volunteer schedules. "You cannot buy your way into my world," she said calmly. "I am not trying to," he replied. "Then why?" He held her gaze steadily. "Because you asked what changes. And I realized I do not want a child simply to inherit my wealth. I want a child to inherit my values. I am still defining those." The honesty in his tone carried no theatrics. Only clarity. She considered his words carefully. "If you fund this center," she said slowly, "it will be governed independently. No influence. No conditions." "Agreed." "And you will not attach your name to it." "Agreed." She searched his expression for hesitation and found none. Outside the office, the sound of students debating college essays drifted through the glass. "You are serious," she said quietly. "Yes." A subtle shift passed between them, not dramatic but significant. She had expected control, perhaps ego. Instead, she found willingness to relinquish both. "Then we draft terms," she said. "My attorney will coordinate with yours," he replied. The process unfolded over the following weeks with surprising ease. Funds were allocated through a foundation structured to preserve anonymity. The community center received new computers, upgraded internet, and a scholarship fund for graduating seniors. No press conference followed. No plaque bearing his name appeared on the wall. Only quiet improvement. One evening, as the center buzzed with activity under brighter lights and newly installed equipment, Amara stood beside Ethan near the back of the room. Students laughed over practice interviews, confidence replacing uncertainty. "They do not know," she said softly. "They do not need to," he replied. She turned toward him. "This is different from the hospital." "Yes," he said. "This is not about crisis. It is about future." The word lingered between them. Outside, dusk settled over the neighborhood, streetlights flickering on one by one. "You still want a child?" she said after a moment. "Yes." "But not as a transaction." "No," she studied him with new eyes. "Then what?" He exhaled slowly, the weight of the question evident in his posture. "Then I wait," he said, "for the right circumstances. For alignment that does not compromise anyone's dignity." The admission carried humility he had never displayed in a boardroom. She felt the subtle steadiness of it. Waiting is unfamiliar territory for you, she observed. Yes, he acknowledged. But some things cannot be acquired. They must be earned. The fluorescent lights above cast a warm glow across the room, reflecting off freshly installed screens and polished desks. The transformation was tangible, not in grandeur, but in possibility. Amara felt something settle inside her, not surrender, not obligation, but cautious respect. He had chosen action without dominance, contribution without claim. As students filtered out into the evening air, Ethan stepped toward the exit. Your mother's next appointment is Thursday, he said. I will be there if you wish. She hesitated only a fraction of a second. You can come, she said quietly. Outside, the night air carried the distant hum of city traffic and the faint scent of winter returning. Two people from different worlds stood side by side beneath a streetlight, neither bound by contract, neither controlled by expectation. What had begun as a transaction had transformed into something far more complex. Not romance, not dependency, something built on deliberate respect and shared vision. And in that deliberate shift, both understood that legacy was no longer a solitary ambition. It was becoming something they were shaping together, choice by choice. Change does not arrive with applause. It arrives quietly, testing whether you meant what you said. Thursday morning unfolded under a pale gray sky, the kind that pressed low over Chicago as if listening. Ethan arrived at Northwestern Oncology 10 minutes early, not because he feared being late, but because punctuality had become his way of honoring promises. He stood near the entrance, hands clasped loosely in front of him, observing families move in and out of the sliding glass doors. There were no tailored suits here, no polished boardroom tables. Only worn winter coats, thermoses of coffee, and the quiet courage of people walking toward uncertainty. When Amara stepped out of her car, she saw him immediately. He did not wave. He did not perform recognition. He simply inclined his head in greeting. She walked toward him, coat wrapped tightly against the cold. You are early, she said softly. I prefer not to rush important things, he replied. Together they entered the building, the familiar scent of antiseptic and warm air settling around them. Inside the infusion room, her mother greeted him with a steadier smile than before. There was more strength in her posture now, less strain in her breathing. Progress had a way of reshaping even the smallest gestures. You keep your word, her mother said to Ethan. I try to, he answered. It is not common, she replied. Amara watched the exchange with thoughtful quiet. There was no longer suspicion in her gaze, only evaluation. During the appointment, Ethan stepped out to take a call from his chief financial officer. The voice on the other end was tight, measured. We have a situation, the chief financial officer said. A shareholder has flagged irregular activity tied to the foundation. They are asking questions. Ethan leaned against the wall in the hallway, eyes focused. On the far window where light filtered through frosted glass. What kind of questions? They are implying conflict of interest. Personal involvement. They are requesting documentation. Ethan exhaled slowly. Provide documentation that complies with the law. Nothing more. And if they escalate? Then they escalate, he replied calmly. We have nothing to hide. When he returned to the infusion room, his expression was composed, but Amara sensed a shift. Something changed, she said quietly. He did not deflect. Questions are being asked, he admitted. About the foundation. Her shoulders straightened. I do not want to be the reason your company suffers. You are not the reason, he said firmly. Integrity withstands scrutiny. She studied him carefully. That sounds confident. It is not confidence, he replied. It is preparation. Later that afternoon, as they left the hospital together, snow began to fall again, light and persistent. The city moved in slow rhythm, tires hissing against wet pavement. If this becomes public, she said, your name will be attached. It already is, he replied evenly. Just not loudly. She stopped walking, turning toward him. I will not let you fight something alone because of me. He looked at her steadily. This is not a fight. It is accountability. The word carried weight, not force. That evening, Ethan attended an emergency meeting with senior board members. The room was dim except for the glow of a large digital screen displaying financial summaries. One director leaned forward, hands folded. You diverted substantial funds without prior disclosure, he said carefully. Through a private foundation, Ethan corrected. legally structured. The optics are questionable, another added. Personal ties raise concerns. Ethan stood at the head of the table, posture straight, voice controlled. There is no conflict of interest, he said. The foundation operates independently. My involvement complies with every regulation. Silence followed, heavy but contained. Are you willing to face a vote? One director asked quietly. Ethan's gaze did not waver. If necessary. The gravity of the statement settled across the room. Across town, Amara sat at her kitchen table, reviewing the same article that had resurfaced online. This time, the tone was sharper. Anonymous sources. Executive favoritism. She felt a flicker of anger, not at him, but at the ease with which assumptions were made. Her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. There may be noise. Do not engage. She stared at the screen before, replying, I am not afraid of noise. His response came moments later. I know. The following day, the board convened again. Investors dialed in from across the country. The discussion was measured but intense. Questions about judgment, about precedent, about reputation. Ethan listened without interruption, then spoke clearly. I have spent my career building this company on principles of calculated risk and long-term vision, he said. If I am to be judged for acting within legal and ethical boundaries to support community infrastructure and medical care, then let that judgment stand on record. The room fell quiet. One by one, the directors cast their votes. The majority supported him. The matter closed without spectacle. When Ethan stepped out of the building later that afternoon, the sky had cleared, revealing a sharp winter blue. He did not feel victorious. He felt aligned. That evening, he drove to the community center where Amara was locking up. She saw the expression on his face before he spoke. It is done, he said simply. They questioned you. Yes. And I remain. She exhaled slowly, relief softening her features. You did not have to risk that. Yes, he said quietly. I did. She stepped closer, not dramatically, but intentionally. Why? She asked again, though her tone held less doubt than before. He looked at her with steady clarity. Because values that are only spoken and never defended are meaningless. The streetlight above them flickered on, casting warm light across the sidewalk. The city hummed in the distance, indifferent to corporate votes and private decisions. Amara felt something settle within her, deeper than gratitude. Respect. Not because he had power, but because he had chosen to use it without retreat. You could have walked away, she said softly. From the foundation. From this. I do not walk away from what is right, he replied. Snowflakes drifted down around them, quiet and unhurried. In that stillness, neither of them spoke for several moments. The path ahead remained uncertain. Public scrutiny could return. Circumstances could shift. But something fundamental had been tested and had held. Ethan Caldwell had faced his own board and chosen integrity over convenience. Amara Brooks had watched without interference, ready to stand beside him if needed. Trust, once fragile, now carried weight. And beneath the steady glow of the streetlight, both understood that whatever came next would not be built on transaction or obligation. It would be built on deliberate choice, proven under pressure. Pressure reveals intention more clearly than comfort ever could. In the weeks following the board vote, Chicago moved into the deep heart of winter, wind cutting sharply between buildings and turning every breath into a visible cloud. Caldwell Tower stood unmoved against the skyline, but inside, the atmosphere carried a subtle shift. Employees who once approached Ethan Caldwell with unfiltered certainty now watched him with a different awareness. He had faced scrutiny and remained steady. That fact traveled quietly through hallways and executive suites. Reputation, he understood, was not damaged by integrity. It was refined by it. Across town, the community center thrived under its new upgrades. Students logged onto modern computers, college applications submitted with confidence rather than hesitation. The scholarship fund had already awarded its first 2 grants. Amara stood near the back of the main room one evening, observing a group of seniors rehearsing interview answers. She listened as a young woman spoke about ambition, about breaking cycles, about building something larger than circumstance. The words echoed differently now. Legacy is not only about bloodlines. It is about impact. She had heard him say it. She had watched him defend it. Still, something within her remained cautious. Respect had grown. Trust had strengthened. But vulnerability required something deeper. That shift arrived unexpectedly on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Amara was at the hospital again, though not for chemotherapy. Her mother was meeting with the oncologist to review updated scans. The waiting room was less crowded than usual, sunlight filtering through tall windows and casting soft shadows across beige walls. Ethan arrived without formal notice, as he often did, coat collar turned up against the cold. He carried no briefcase, no visible sign of corporate armor. "You did not have to come," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "I wanted to." The doctor called them back together. Inside the consultation room, charts and scans glowed faintly on a mounted screen. The physician spoke with measured clarity. The treatment was working. Tumor markers had decreased. Continued therapy was recommended, but the trajectory was promising. Relief did not arrive as an explosion. It arrived as a quiet loosening in Amara's chest, a breath she had been holding for months finally released. Her mother closed her eyes briefly, gratitude evident in the slight tremor of her hands. Ethan remained silent, allowing the moment to belong to them. Outside the room, as her mother was guided toward scheduling, Amara stood facing him in the hallway. There were no words for several seconds. Only the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of hospital staff. "You were here for the worst," she said quietly. "You are here for the better." He looked at her steadily. "Consistency," he replied again. Something in her expression shifted. Not hesitation, not doubt, something softer. "You said you would wait," she said. "Yes." "What does waiting look like for you?" He considered the question carefully. "It looks like presence without pressure," he said. "Support without expectation." She studied him, measuring the weight of his words. "And if nothing changes?" she asked. "Then nothing changes," he answered. "My choices remain my own." The simplicity of that response disarmed her more than any grand declaration could have. That evening, snow fell heavily again, blanketing sidewalks and softening the noise of the city. Ethan drove her and her mother home from the hospital. Inside the modest apartment, warmth replaced the winter chill. The scent of soup simmering on the stove filled the kitchen. Amara's mother insisted on pouring 3 cups of tea, hands steadier than they had been weeks before. "Sit," she instructed Ethan gently. He obeyed without hesitation, taking a seat at the small kitchen table. The space was simple, lived in, filled with photographs and worn bookshelves. It stood in stark contrast to the glass and steel of his penthouse. Yet he appeared comfortable, unguarded. "You have done much," her mother said quietly, meeting his eyes across the table. "Why?" Ethan did not rush his answer. "Because I was given much," he said. "And I learned that possession without purpose is empty." Her mother studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Purpose is not inherited," she said. "It is chosen." The words settled into the room with gentle authority. Later, after her mother retired for the night, Amara walked Ethan to the door. The hallway outside was dimly lit, the building quiet except for distant footsteps on another floor. "I used to think strength meant never needing anyone," she said softly. "It often feels that way," he replied. "But it is not always true." She leaned lightly against the wall, arms relaxed at her sides. "You have not asked me to revisit the original plan," she said. "No, even though you still want a child." "Yes." "Why?" His gaze held hers without urgency. "Because I no longer see that path as something to secure through agreement," he said. "If I become a father, it will be through alignment, not transaction." The hallway light cast a warm glow across his features, softening the sharp edges she had once associated with him. "And if alignment means something neither of us expected?" she asked quietly. "Then we face it honestly," he replied. Silence followed, but it was not empty. It carried recognition. Months ago, their connection had been defined by paperwork and clinical terms. Now it was defined by shared experience under pressure. He had stood in boardrooms defending integrity. She had stood in hospital corridors defending dignity. Both had remained steady. Outside, snow continued to fall, muting the city's restless rhythm. "You are changing," she said finally. "So are you," he answered. She smiled faintly at that. Not because it was flattering, but because it was true. Growth had found them both in unexpected places. As he stepped toward the stairwell, she felt the weight of possibility settle gently in her chest. Not obligation, not expectation, possibility. And for the first time since this journey began, the future did not feel like a contract waiting to be signed. It felt like something unfolding naturally, shaped not by power, but by choice. Not every turning point arrives with a declaration. Some arrive in the quiet realization that fear has loosened its grip. By early March, Chicago began to thaw. Snow receded into gray slush along the sidewalks, and the wind off Lake Michigan carried a hint of something softer. At Northwestern Oncology, Amara sat beside her mother as the oncologist reviewed the latest scans. This time, the doctor's tone carried restrained optimism. The tumors had shrunk significantly. Continued treatment would remain necessary, but remission was no longer a distant word. It hovered within reach. Amara felt the news settle in her chest like sunlight breaking through cloud cover. Her mother closed her eyes briefly, whispering a quiet prayer of gratitude. Ethan stood a respectful distance away, hands loosely clasped, absorbing the moment without intrusion. When they stepped into the hallway afterward, Amara turned to him, her eyes brighter than they had been in months. "She has a real chance," she said softly. "Yes," he replied. "She does." There was no triumph in his voice, only steady acknowledgement. That afternoon, Ethan returned to Caldwell Tower with an unfamiliar lightness in his step. He moved through meetings with calm precision, but his mind carried images of the hospital corridor and the subtle strength in Amara's expression. For years, he had chased expansion and acquisition as markers of progress. Now progress looked different. It looked like a woman breathing easier in a hospital room. It looked like students at a community center opening acceptance letters. It looked like a future that was no longer defined by urgency. Later that week, Amara invited him to dinner. The invitation was simple, almost understated. "My mother would like you to come by on Friday," she had said. "If you are free." Ethan cleared his calendar without hesitation. On Friday evening, he arrived at the apartment with no entourage, no driver waiting outside. He carried a modest bouquet of white lilies, chosen after a brief consultation with a florist who assured him they symbolized renewal. Inside, the apartment felt warmer than usual. The scent of roasted vegetables and fresh bread filled the air. Amara's mother stood at the stove, her movements slower than before but steady. "You are punctual," she observed as Ethan entered. "I consider it respectful," he replied, offering the flowers. She accepted them with a nod. "Sit," she instructed again, echoing her earlier command from weeks ago. The three of them gathered around the small kitchen table. The meal was simple but intentional. Conversation flowed more easily now. They spoke of neighborhood changes, of students earning scholarships, of spring approaching. There was laughter at one point, quiet but genuine. Ethan felt the unfamiliar comfort of being in a space where he was not the center of gravity. After dinner, as dishes were cleared and tea poured, Amara's mother studied him thoughtfully. "You have stood beside us through difficulty," she said. "What do you seek in return?" The question was not suspicious. It was discerning. Ethan met her gaze evenly. "Nothing," he said. "Then why remain?" she pressed gently. He took a moment before answering. "Because I no longer see this as charity or obligation," he said. "I see it as alignment. And I do not walk away from alignment when it is right." Her mother nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "Alignment requires courage," she said. "It also requires humility." He inclined his head. "I am learning both." Later, when her mother retired for the night, Amara walked him to the balcony. The city lights shimmered against the dark sky, reflections rippling faintly in distant windows. The air carried the cool edge of early spring. "You have changed," she said quietly. "Change is uncomfortable," he replied. "But necessary." She leaned against the railing, studying the skyline. "I used to believe strength meant doing everything alone," she admitted. "It often feels that way," he said, "especially when survival is involved." She turned toward him, eyes searching. "And now?" He did not hesitate. "Now I believe strength can also mean choosing partnership." The word lingered between them. Partnership, not ownership, not transaction, something shared. "You still want to be a father," she said. "Yes." "And you are no longer seeking a contract to achieve it." No. Silence settled gently around them. The city below pulsed with life, unaware of the quiet transformation unfolding above. "If you were to become a father," she said carefully, "what kind would you be?" He exhaled slowly, considering the weight of the question. "Present," he said. "Accountable. Willing to listen. Not simply provide." Her expression softened. "That is different from the man who walked into that clinic months ago." "Yes," he agreed. It is. A faint breeze stirred her curls. And if fatherhood required more than legacy, she asked. If it required vulnerability? He looked at her steadily. Then I would meet it honestly. She held his gaze, the distance between them no longer defined by negotiation, but by possibility. There are no guarantees, she said quietly. I am aware, he replied. That is what makes the choice meaningful. The conversation did not escalate into declarations. It remained grounded, deliberate. But something fundamental shifted in that moment. The idea of alignment no longer felt abstract. It felt tangible, not because circumstances demanded it, but because both of them had grown into it. Weeks later, as spring finally edged into Chicago with brighter mornings and longer evenings, Ethan found himself in the community center gymnasium watching a scholarship ceremony unfold. Amara stood at the podium, introducing recipients with composed pride. Students applauded, parents wiped away tears. Ethan remained at the back, unnoticed by most, observing the impact he had once measured only in quarterly returns. When the ceremony ended, Amara joined him near the exit. You see, she said softly. Impact. He nodded. Yes. She studied him for a moment longer, then spoke with quiet clarity. If alignment is real, she said, it must be mutual. He met her gaze without hesitation. It is. Outside, the evening sky glowed faintly pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. The future remained unwritten, but no longer uncertain in the same way. It was no longer about contracts or obligations. It was about two people who had stood beside each other through scrutiny and healing, through doubt and defense. And in that shared resilience, something stronger than transaction had taken root. Not because it was convenient, but because it was chosen. Spring did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in cautious layers, like trust itself. By mid-April, the trees along Michigan Avenue began to show faint green buds, and the air carried a softness that had been absent for months. The city felt lighter, as if something long endured had finally begun to ease. At Northwestern Oncology, the latest scan confirmed what hope had whispered weeks earlier. Amara's mother was officially in partial remission. Continued monitoring would be required, but the urgency that once shadowed every appointment had lifted. When the doctor delivered the news, Amara closed her eyes briefly, absorbing it. Her mother reached for her hand and squeezed gently, strength returning not only to her body but to her voice. Ethan stood beside them, silent but present, his posture steady. Outside the hospital, sunlight filtered through the glass facade, casting bright reflections across the pavement. You stayed, Amara said quietly once they stepped into the open air. Yes, he replied, even when it was complicated. Especially then, he corrected softly. That evening, Ethan returned to Caldwell Tower for a shareholders' reception that had been scheduled months earlier. The ballroom on the top floor shimmered with soft lighting and crystal glassware. Conversations flowed around market trends and quarterly projections. He moved through the room with practiced ease, acknowledging investors and board members with composed confidence. Yet something within him had shifted. The metrics that once defined success now felt incomplete. When one investor approached him with a congratulatory handshake, praising his resilience during recent scrutiny, Ethan responded evenly. Integrity is not resilience, he said. It is baseline. The investor blinked, slightly surprised by the simplicity of the statement. Across town, Amara stood on the balcony of her apartment, watching. The city lights flicker on one by one. Her mother rested inside, fatigue replaced by steady recovery. The quiet hum of traffic below felt different now, less urgent. She thought about the months behind them. The clinic room. The contract that had never been signed. The foundation questioned. The board vote. The hospital corridor. Each moment had tested something. Not only him. Her too. Later that week, Ethan asked her to join him for dinner. Not at a corporate venue. Not at a private members club. At a small restaurant near the lake where the windows overlooked the water and the atmosphere remained understated. She arrived in a simple navy dress, hair falling naturally around her shoulders. He stood when she approached the table, not as performance, but as habit reshaped by respect. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the soft clink of silverware. For a while, they spoke of ordinary things. The community center's upcoming summer program, her mother's physical therapy, his expansion into renewable energy projects. Eventually, the conversation settled into a deeper current. There is something I need to say clearly, he said, his tone measured but unguarded. She met his gaze without hesitation. Then say it. He exhaled slowly. When I first considered fatherhood, I approached it like a strategic objective. A timeline. A transaction. I believed legacy could be secured through efficiency. She listened, silent but attentive. You showed me that legacy without alignment is hollow, he continued. If I become a father, I want it to be within a partnership defined by respect and choice. Not urgency. The words did not rush. They carried intention. She absorbed them carefully. And what are you asking? She said softly. I am not asking for an answer tonight, he replied. I am asking whether you see a future where we explore that possibility together. Without contract. Without pressure. As equals. Silence settled across the table, not heavy but reflective. Outside the window, the lake rippled under the fading light, steady and expansive. You are asking for more than partnership, she said finally. You are asking for vulnerability. Yes, he said. I am. She studied him in the warm glow of the restaurant lighting, noticing how different he felt from the man who had once viewed her through the lens of a file. Vulnerability is not efficient, she said quietly. No, he agreed. But it is honest. She looked down briefly at her hands resting on the table, then back up at him. I will not be rushed, she said. I will not compromise my independence. I would not want you to, he replied. And if we choose this path, it will be because it strengthens both of us. Not because it fulfills an old plan. He nodded once. Agreed. There was no dramatic declaration. No sudden embrace. Only clarity exchanged across a table overlooking the water. As they left the restaurant, the night air felt mild, carrying the scent of the lake and the distant hum of traffic. They walked side by side along the shoreline, steps unhurried. My mother likes you, she said softly. That is encouraging, he replied. She also warned me that humility must remain. He allowed a faint smile. I am still learning it. They stopped near the railing, city lights reflecting off the water's surface. This began with a contract, she said. It did. And now? He looked at her steadily. Now it begins with choice. The word lingered between them, steady as the water before them. Months earlier, their connection had been defined by urgency and survival. Now it was defined by deliberate growth. The possibility of a future no longer felt like a calculated objective. It felt like something unfolding naturally, shaped by respect tested under pressure. And as the wind moved gently across the lake, neither spoke for several moments. They did not need to. The path ahead remained unwritten, but it was no longer driven by fear or transaction. It was driven by alignment. And that, both of them knew, was a foundation stronger than any contract ever signed. By early May, Chicago no longer whispered about winter. It breathed in full color. Tulips lined the sidewalks near the lake, and the air carried a softness that felt almost forgiving. Change had not arrived in a single dramatic moment. It had unfolded through decisions, through restraint, through presence. And now it stood quietly at the edge of something new. Ethan stood in his office at Caldwell Tower, sunlight spilling across the polished floor, the skyline sharp and bright beyond the glass. He held his phone in his hand longer than usual before pressing call. I have been thinking, he said when Amara answered. That is usually dangerous, she replied lightly. There was warmth in her voice now, something that had grown naturally over months of shared endurance. Meet me at the community center tonight, he said. There is something I want you to see. When she arrived that evening, the gymnasium was empty except for a small group of staff gathered near the stage. The scholarship program had expanded again, but that was not what caught her attention. A new initiative banner hung across the wall, simple and understated. Future Leaders Family Program. She turned toward him. You did not tell me about this. It is not mine, he said. It is ours, if you want it to be. She studied the details printed on the banner. The program would provide mentorship and parenting resources to young families in the neighborhood, offering guidance not only on education and career pathways, but on building stable homes. This is about more than scholarships, she said quietly. Yes, he replied. It is about what happens after opportunity arrives. She felt the weight of his words. You are thinking about fatherhood differently, she observed. I am thinking about it completely differently, he said. Not as inheritance. As responsibility. The staff members approached to explain the logistics, how the program would launch in June, how volunteers were already signing up. Amara listened, but her focus remained on him. When the room cleared, she stepped closer. "You are building infrastructure," she said, "before there is even a child." "Because fatherhood is not a title," he replied. "It is preparation." Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting warm light through the gymnasium windows. Dust particles floated gently in the glow. "You said you would not rush me," she reminded him. "I meant that," he said. "This is not pressure. It is clarity." She nodded slowly. That night, she lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom while the city hummed faintly outside. Months ago, survival had dictated every decision. Now possibility required something braver than endurance. It required openness. The following weekend, she invited him to join her and her mother at a small park near the lake. Children ran across the grass, laughter carried on the breeze, and families gathered beneath blooming trees. Ethan stood beside her, watching a young father kneel to tie his daughter's shoe. "You observe everything," she said softly. "I am learning," he replied. "From what?" "From what is natural." They walked along the path, unhurried. "My mother asked me something last night," she said. "What?" "She asked whether I see you in my future, or whether I see you in my crisis." He absorbed that quietly. "And your answer?" She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "You are not my crisis," she said. "You were never that. You were a decision." The distinction settled between them with quiet power. "And now?" he asked gently. She took a steady breath. "Now I see you in my future." There was no applause, no dramatic shift in the air, only stillness, intentional and real. He did not reach for her immediately. He simply held her gaze, understanding the weight of what she had offered. "Then we move forward," he said softly. Together. Weeks passed with deliberate care. They did not rush into declarations. They spent evenings discussing values, expectations, fears. He shared stories of his childhood, of growing up in a house where achievement was praised but vulnerability was not. She spoke of watching her mother build strength from scarcity, of learning that dignity could survive anything. These conversations were not romantic in the traditional sense. They were foundational. One evening, as they sat on her balcony watching the sunset stain the sky in shades of gold and pink, she spoke with quiet certainty. "If we choose to build a family," she said, "it will not be because you need an heir." "No," he agreed. "It will be because we are aligned." She reached for his hand then, not tentatively, but intentionally. "Then let us choose alignment." The city lights flickered on beneath them, the world continuing its steady rhythm. Months ago, their story had begun in a clinic room defined by paperwork and caution. Now it stood in open air, shaped by integrity tested under scrutiny and tenderness earned through patience. Ethan no longer measured fatherhood by timeline. Amara no longer measured strength by solitude. Together, they had redefined both. And as summer approached Chicago with longer days and brighter skies, the foundation beneath them felt steady. Not because it had been engineered for advantage, but because it had been built through respect, defended under pressure, and chosen freely. In that quiet certainty, the future no longer felt like a contract waiting to be signed. It felt like a life waiting to unfold. Summer arrived in Chicago with long golden evenings and air that felt generous. Instead of sharp, the city no longer braced against the cold. It opened. Along the lakefront, families spread blankets across fresh green grass. Children chased one another beneath clear skies, and the skyline shimmered in heat that rose gently from the pavement. Change had fully taken root. It was no longer fragile. It was visible. At Northwestern Oncology, Amara's mother completed another round of follow-up tests. This time the appointment was brief, almost routine. The oncologist smiled with restrained optimism, explaining that remission continued to hold. Monitoring would remain part of life, but urgency had given way to maintenance. Outside the clinic, sunlight flooded the sidewalk. Amara felt something shift inside her, something she had not allowed herself to feel for nearly a year. Relief without caution. When she turned toward Ethan, he saw it immediately in her eyes. "She is strong," he said softly. "She is," Amara replied. "And so are you." The words did not embarrass her the way they once might have. Strength no longer meant isolation. It meant endurance shared. Weeks passed with deliberate calm. Ethan continued overseeing Caldwell Enterprises, but the intensity that once defined every decision had softened. He delegated more. He listened longer. Employees noticed the difference. He still commanded the room when necessary, but he no longer equated control with certainty. Even his chief financial officer remarked one afternoon, "You seem steadier." Ethan had answered simply, "I am clearer." Meanwhile, the Future Leaders Family Program launched officially at the community center. The first workshop filled every folding chair in the gymnasium. Young parents sat beside mentors, discussing financial planning, emotional development, and long-term vision. Amara stood at the front of the room, confident and composed, guiding the discussion with natural authority. Ethan remained in the back as usual, observing without claiming attention. After the session ended, she approached him, a quiet glow in her expression. "It is working," she said. "Yes," he replied. "It is. You built this without knowing whether we would ever need it personally." He met her gaze steadily. It was never about personal need. It was about alignment. She absorbed that word again. Alignment had once felt theoretical. Now it felt lived. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the lake, painting the sky in layers of amber and rose, Amara invited him to walk with her along the shoreline. The breeze carried warmth, and the water reflected the fading light like liquid glass. They moved side by side, steps unhurried. "I have been thinking about something," she said quietly. "That is usually powerful," he replied with a faint smile. She stopped near the railing, turning to face him. "When we first met, everything was defined by urgency. Survival, timeline, obligation." "Yes," he agreed. "Now nothing feels urgent," she continued. "It feels intentional." He nodded. Intention is stronger than urgency. She studied him for a moment longer, as if measuring whether the next words belonged in the open air between them. "If we choose to build a family," she said slowly, "I want it to be from wholeness. Not from rescue. Not from compensation. I would expect nothing less," he replied. There was no hesitation in his tone, only steadiness. "Then I need to know something," she added. "If that path is slower than you once imagined, will you still stand here?" He did not look away. "Yes." "Even if it requires patience you have never practiced?" "Yes." The simplicity of his answer held weight because it was not impulsive. It had been shaped by months of tested resolve. She exhaled slowly, a breath that carried decision rather than doubt. "Then I am ready to move forward," she said. "Not because I owe you, not because of what you have done, but because I see who you have become." The wind moved gently around them, lifting a strand of her hair across her cheek. He reached up carefully, brushing it aside with deliberate tenderness, not possession. "And I see who you have always been," he replied. They did not rush the next steps. Instead, they spoke with a fertility specialist weeks later, this time sitting beside one another not as contractor and candidate, but as partners. The conversation felt different. There were no clauses about detachment, no emphasis on transaction, only discussions about health, readiness, and shared responsibility. The doctor explained options calmly, outlining timelines measured in months rather than demands measured in urgency. When they left the office, Ethan did not carry a folder as a symbol of control. He carried her hand. Summer deepened across Chicago. Evenings grew longer. One afternoon, Amara stood in the doorway of her apartment watching Ethan help her mother plant flowers in small pots along the balcony. He moved carefully, listening to instructions about soil depth and sunlight. Exposure with surprising attentiveness. Her mother laughed softly at one point, shaking her head. "You follow directions well," she teased. "I am learning," he replied again. The word had become familiar, but it no longer felt uncertain. It felt intentional. Later, when the balcony was filled with bright blooms and the air carried the scent of fresh earth, her mother turned to Amara with quiet clarity. "He did not come to rescue us," she said. "He came to grow with us." Amara felt the truth of that settle deeply. Growth required roots. Roots required patience. That night, as the city lights shimmered beyond the balcony railing, she stood beside Ethan in comfortable silence. "Do you remember the clinic room?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said. "I remember stopping." She nodded. Stopping changed everything. "Yes," he agreed. It did. The journey from that moment to this one had not been dramatic in spectacle. It had been dramatic in discipline. He had chosen restraint when advantage was available. She had chosen openness when independence felt safer. Together, they had built something that did not rely on urgency or imbalance. And as summer air moved gently through the open windows, carrying the distant sound of laughter from the street below. Both understood that what lay ahead would not be shaped by contracts or fear. It would be shaped by the same principles that had carried them here. Respect, accountability, alignment freely chosen. The future no longer hovered as a question. It unfolded quietly before them, steady and real. Autumn did not ask permission before arriving. By late September, Chicago carried a different light, softer and more reflective, as if the city itself understood that growth had seasons. The trees along the lakefront shifted from green to gold, and the air held a quiet crispness that invited deeper breaths. Nearly a year had passed since the day a contract had almost defined two lives. Now nothing about their story felt contractual. It felt earned. In a sunlit examination room overlooking Michigan Avenue, Amara sat beside Ethan as the doctor confirmed what they had both sensed for weeks. The pregnancy was healthy, early, steady, progressing exactly as it should. The words did not land with shock. They settled with calm certainty. Amara felt Ethan's hand tighten gently around hers, not in fear, not in urgency, but in recognition. This was not an objective achieved. It was a responsibility accepted. Outside the clinic, the city moved as it always did, taxis honking in distant impatience, office workers crossing intersections beneath tall glass towers. Ethan paused on the sidewalk, looking not at the skyline he had once believed defined his legacy, but at the woman beside him. "We begin," he said quietly. "We continue," she corrected softly. Because this had not begun in a doctor's office. It had begun in restraint, in a choice not to proceed when proceeding would have been easier. It had begun in hospital corridors and boardroom votes, in community classrooms and balcony conversations. Now it simply moved forward. As the weeks unfolded, their rhythm adjusted. Ethan attended fewer evening receptions, choosing instead to cook dinner in Amara's kitchen, learning recipes her mother dictated with careful precision. He accompanied Amara to prenatal appointments without announcement or spectacle. At Caldwell Tower, he informed his executive team that he would be restructuring certain responsibilities in anticipation of fatherhood. The room had fallen silent for a moment, not in disbelief, but in recalibration. This was a different version of their leader. Not diminished, grounded. Meanwhile, the community center expanded again, fueled by volunteers inspired not by wealth, but by visible commitment. The Future Leaders Family Program now included workshops on emotional literacy and financial planning for new parents. Amara moved through the halls with steady confidence, her presence carrying quiet authority. When students asked about her growing belly, she smiled without defensiveness. Alignment, she would say simply. One evening, as golden light filtered through the apartment windows, her mother sat across from Ethan at the small kitchen table. "You understand," she said calmly, "that fatherhood is not performance." "Yes," he replied. "It is presence." She nodded approvingly, then remained present. He absorbed the instruction not as criticism, but as guidance. Months earlier, he would have approached impending fatherhood with strategic outlines and projected milestones. Now he approached it with humility, aware that no spreadsheet could measure the weight of a child's trust. As winter approached once more, Chicago returned to its familiar chill. Snow-dusted rooftops, and the lake turned a deeper shade of gray. Inside the hospital maternity wing, the air was warm and filled with anticipation. Ethan stood beside Amara, his composure steady but his eyes reflecting something new, something tender and unguarded. When their daughter entered the world, her cry was not dramatic. It was strong, clear, present. Ethan felt something shift permanently within him as he held her for the first time. Not ownership, not pride, responsibility shaped by love. Amara watched him closely, recognizing the quiet transformation in his posture. The man who once measured legacy in quarterly growth now measured it in ounces and heartbeats. Later, as snow fell gently outside the hospital window, they sat together in the dimly lit room, their daughter resting peacefully between them. "She will inherit your resilience," he said softly to Amara. "And your integrity," she replied. He shook his head slightly. "She will inherit alignment," he corrected. Weeks later, as the city celebrated the holidays beneath strings of white lights and evergreen wreaths, they returned home as a family. Caldwell Tower remained visible in the distance, a symbol of what Ethan had built. But it no longer defined him. What defined him now was the small life cradled against his chest, the steady rhythm of breath that depended not on contracts or negotiation, but on presence. At the community center, the first family workshop of the new year included a guest speaker. Ethan stood before a modest crowd of parents and mentors, not in a tailored presentation, but in quiet authenticity. Leadership, he said, begins with restraint. It continues with accountability, and it is sustained through respect. Amara watched from the back of the room, their daughter resting against her shoulder. The room did not erupt in applause. It did something more powerful. It listened. Later that evening, as they walked along the snow-lined lakefront, city lights reflecting across the frozen surface, Amara paused. "Do you ever think about the clinic room?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said. "Often. If you had signed that contract," he shook his head gently, "I would have gained a child and lost alignment." She nodded. Because stopping had not been weakness. It had been the beginning of everything. The wind moved around them, crisp but not harsh. Their daughter stirred slightly, then settled again. Chicago stood steady behind them, towers illuminated against the winter sky. Power had once defined Ethan Caldwell. Dignity had always defined Amara Brooks. Together, they had redefined legacy, not as something acquired, not as something hidden behind glass and steel, but as something lived openly, defended quietly, and chosen freely. And beneath the glow of streetlights reflecting on fresh snow, their story no longer felt like a reversal or a rescue. It felt like proof. Proof that restraint can be stronger than ambition, that respect can be louder than authority, and that alignment, once chosen, becomes the foundation on which everything else stands.